Thank you all very much. Let's see if how's that? Does that sound all right? Cool. Thank you for that great introduction. I really, really appreciate it. And thanks all of you for hanging in here for the last talk of the day. I really want to thank the organizers putting this together, the Department of Communication Studies, and everybody on the coordinating committee. This has been a fantastic event, so clearly all of your hard work has come together. I'm really, honored to be here and representing in the memory of Sam Becker, which I think is a fantastic thing to celebrate. I'm also happy to be representing here for the queers of color in the field of communication. This is a work in progress, so it's something that's pretty much hot off the press. By pretty much, I mean I really just finished this first draft, so happy to get your feedback on this. It's from the new project that I'm working on. I also wanted to mention, you'll notice the title got infinitely more boring than it was before I removed the Militant Homosexuals. They come into this story a little bit later than what is in this presentation. They were just getting organized during the time here. So the only militant homosexual today will be me. But hopefully that'll be all right. So, get started here. Despite a diverse history of AIDS activism, both scholars and lay people have tended to imagine HIV/AIDS in the U.S. largely in relation to gay men. The most memorialized and discussed AIDS activism from the early pandemic emerged from ACT UP, or the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, a group typically remembered for its use of queer, often militant political strategies on behalf of white, middle-class, urban, gay male U.S. citizens. Now, the Centers for Disease Control reports that more than half of HIV/AIDS cases in the U.S. have afflicted men who have sex with men. Nevertheless, as AIDS scholar Brett Stockdill writes, HIV/AIDS has always been a problem that has severely affected those at the intersections of multiple oppressions: homophobia, racism, sexism, and classism in particular. What Stockdill does not develop, and most others who write about AIDS activism minimize or miss, however, is the way in which xenophobia and norms of citizenship also function as sites of oppression, greatly impacting people's experiences with HIV/AIDS. Since the beginning, U.S. immigrant communities from Haiti, Africa, Asia, and Latin America were not only devastated by AIDS, but some of these immigrant groups were also widely stigmatized as the supposed origins of AIDS and as high-risk groups for contracting the disease. Furthermore, early on in the pandemic, U.S. policymakers swiftly passed laws and provisions banning those with HIV from migrating to the U.S., and forcing those already here deeply underground in order to avoid detection, possible detention, and deportation. Very little is known about the community work, sense-making, and rhetorical practices of AIDS activists pertaining to immigration policies and within immigrant communities. My next book, which would be tentatively called AIDS Knows No Borders, a slogan and rallying cry of AIDS activists fighting restrictive immigration policies for those with HIV and AIDS during the late 20th century, will show how AIDS and immigration activists have constructed coalitions to radically alter U.S. health and immigration policy and politics from the start of AIDS in 1981 until the lifting of the ban on HIV-positive immigration in 2010. But progressive coalitions of community activists are only one kind of coalition politics at the intersection of AIDS and immigration. Elected officials and governmental agencies from across the political spectrum also constructed coalitions and shared coalitional moments, these instances where two seemingly unlikely issues or rhetors are in political concert, within deliberative contexts in order to promote immigration policies on HIV/AIDS. In part, the actions that resulted from some of these deliberative coalitions created the exigence for progressive and radical activists to organize at the intersection of AIDS and immigration and within immigrant communities to address the devastating impacts of AIDS. Such coalitions and coalitional moments formed during congressional debates are one part of the political context for AIDS activists' emphasis on immigration. So in this talk, I offer a close examination of one such coalitional moment, which I'll just simply talk here about as coalition. This coalition led to the development of the HIV exclusion rule in immigration law, which was put into motion in 1985 and made into law for the first time in 1987. I focus specifically on the Senate debates about whether to exclude immigrants with AIDS or HIV infection from the United States during the spring of 1987. This talk will center primarily on the predominant themes within the rhetoric of the key actors, Senator Jesse Helms, who you see here closest to me. I should have put him further away from me. And his self-described nemesis there on my right, Senator Lowell Weaker, in order to show how seemingly irreconcilable differences between what Weaker described as philosophy and science are in fact reconciled through a coalition premised upon a rhetoric I call national common sense. National common sense differs slightly from traditional conceptualizations of common sense. William F. Lewis articulates such a conceptualization, stating, "Reliance on a common sense understanding de-emphasizes objections based on claims to special knowledge or expertise. Common sense is so obvious to those who accept it that disagreement with its implications will often seem irrelevant, impractical, or unintelligible." Lewis continues, "Common sense establishes a transparent realism. A common sense statement is what everyone knows. A common sense judgment is what any sensible person would do. Even in science controversies, John Line tells us, rhetors often make appeals to common sense." Now, Helms relied primarily on this traditional form of common sense to make his arguments. But in relying on national common sense, a rhetor appeals to and encourages judgments that everyone knows are best for the nation. Political and social theorists have highlighted the importance of challenging the nation as a unified or coherent construct. And in line with such thinking, Benedict Anderson has famously argued that a nation is an imagined collective. The imaginary status of the nation is part of what gives appeals to the nation their persuasive thrust, as rhetors work to ensure audiences and interlocutors share their ideal. This national social imaginary, as Shane Phelan argues, is the persistent clusters of images and rhetoric that, however inadequately and imperfectly, signal to a population who and what it is. I've extended this idea suggesting that national social imaginaries are uniquely rhetorical, as they operate in and through persuasive messages, images, and ideologies designed to move people toward particular ways of existing and envisioning themselves and others. As such, arguments relying upon and appealing to national common sense assume the two most important judgments that everyone will agree upon are the need to protect national borders and to protect the proper citizenry. During the 1987 debates, reliance on national common sense enabled an unlikely coalition with significant political impact. Weaker fundamentally disagreed with almost everything Helms rhetorically located in the realm of common sense, but their shared, though often unstated, commitment to national common sense not only led to the scapegoating and exclusion of immigrants, but also to the subtle reinforcement of deeply conservative logics about belonging, borders, and community. Understanding the production of this coalition and the premise upon which it is created is important because this study will intervene in much of the scholarship on coalitions, which figures them as entities or relationships that are only or primarily progressive, thereby missing how coalitions work to achieve anti-democratic and politically conservative objectives. Existing scholarship also focuses almost entirely on activist contexts as opposed to institutional, deliberative ones. Also, the study will contribute to our understanding of common sense and its many rhetorical manifestations, which illuminates the logics of an important source of rhetorical invention. And finally, this study contributes to public memory on HIV/AIDS by addressing an important, prolific site of rhetoric about HIV/AIDS that has hardly been mentioned in the scholarly record, even as it reveals the way that AIDS structured the nation and its proper citizenry. So I begin this presentation by contextualizing how the panic around AIDS makes its way into immigration policy before turning close attention to the function of common sense in the spring of 1987 Senate debates. It'll be a very boring PowerPoint show today, just so you know. So we'll start out with AIDS, panic, and immigration policy. Worries about what immigrants bring with them: culture, language, inferior genetic stock, and disease, to name a few concerns, have been central to immigration debates in the United States at least since the late 19th century. These fears came to a proverbial head during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. By 1988, the United States had more reported AIDS cases than the entire rest of the world combined, totaling nearly 60% of known cases. Fingers pointed from the United States to Africa and Haiti as the culprits, but by sheer number alone, whether AIDS originated in the United States, this country, more than any other, was the breeding ground for its spread. Most of the world regarded the United States as the primary exporter of AIDS. But despite these facts, key members of the Reagan administration, as well as members of the US Congress, supported and advocated passing laws to exclude those with HIV/AIDS from migrating to this country in order to supposedly stop the spread of HIV in the United States. In reading media, legal, and health news between 1985 and 1993, the years when the ban is first introduced, signed into law, and finally codified, only a few experts thought that excluding HIV-positive immigrants was a good idea. For example, the World Health Organization maintained that travel bans due to HIV infection were against the international health regulations, which the US supposedly agreed with. Physicians argued that exclusion would do little to stop the spread of HIV infection, and many legal experts and public health officials agreed. Nevertheless, before President Reagan had uttered the word AIDS publicly, his administration quietly and perhaps fearfully worked on AIDS policy. Struggles over how to approach domestic AIDS policy were central to this secret flurry of policy development, yet immigration law was also set to be a prime target. In November 1985, the acting Assistant Secretary of Health, James O. Mason, put forth a recommendation to add AIDS to the list of, quote, dangerous contagious diseases that render a person excludable under Section 212A of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Secretary Otis R. Bowen approved this proposal in January 1986, and it was put forward for public comment in April. By June of the following year, upon review of the comments received from 116 individuals and 16 organizations, the Department of Health and Human Services decided to add AIDS to the list, and shortly thereafter amended the ruling to substitute HIV infection for AIDS, quote, since individuals who are so infected but do not actually have AIDS are also contagious. This ruling was published just a week after Reagan's first public speech devoted entirely to AIDS on May 31st, 1987, and simultaneously to the Senate debates and a final vote that implored the president to, quote, add human immunodeficiency virus infection to the list of dangerous contagious diseases contained in Title 42 of the Code of Federal Regulations. By December 1st of that year, the exclusion was firmly in place. Though both Presidents Bush Sr. and Clinton sought to remove HIV infection from the list of dangerous diseases in 1991 and 1993 respectively, neither succeeded. In fact, despite campaign promises to the contrary, under conservative pressure, Clinton codified the HIV exclusion, which Republicans wrote into the 1993 National Institutes of Health Revitalization Act. And the exclusion remained firmly in place until its official lifting in January of 2010. As N. Ordover argues, the impacts for already vulnerable people were devastating. HIV-positive undocumented people living in the United States could not regulate their immigration status and were thus more likely to end up in detention. Many people did not seek health care due to fears of deportation and so often only showed up in emergency rooms once they were too sick to help. The exclusion also, as Ordover says, nurtured the age-old myth of the menacing diseased alien, and furthermore promoted a, quote, false sense of protection and of demarcation, suggesting that HIV is something outside, and we can keep it that way. So now I'm going to turn attention to looking at these debates from the spring of 1987. Now, the late Senator Jesse Helms is a regular villain in stories of HIV and AIDS in the United States, and this story will prove no exception. On May 7th, 1987, amidst increasing pressure on the federal government generally and the Reagan administration specifically to adopt a formal and systematic response to the AIDS crisis, the U.S. Senate began debate on H.R. 1827, the Supplemental Appropriations Act of 1987, and that had recently been sent to it by the House of Representatives. Included in the act was an emergency provision to provide $30 million in funding to those with AIDS who had volunteered to participate in clinical trials for the drug AZT and who were too poor to afford to continue to take the medication now that it was approved and actually on the market. On May 21st, 1987, Helms proposed Amendment Number 212 to the Act, which attached a contingency to the emergency funds. Namely, it said that they could be released provided that none of the funds appropriated under this heading shall be available for use in any state, the District of Columbia, or any territory of the United States, unless such state, district, or territory requires, as a condition of the granting of a marriage license, testing negatively for infection with the human immunodeficiency virus, provided further that Section 212A6 of the Immigration and Nationality Act is amended by inserting before the semicolon at the end thereof of the following, or who test positively for infection with the human immunodeficiency virus. Now, this amendment sparked impassioned debate with senators from all sides of the political spectrum offering their perspectives. The most notable challenger to Helms was Senator Lowell P. Wicker Jr., the Republican from Connecticut, often regarded as the most liberal Republican in the Senate during the 1980s. Wicker was also recognized, or generally considered, an outlier in the Republican Party on the issue of AIDS, and he was recognized as an important leader in bringing attention and funding to education, research, and prevention efforts. He disagreed strongly with those like Helms and members of the Reagan administration, like Education Secretary William Bennett and Domestic Policy Advisor Gary Bauer, who felt that testing was the only way to ensure the stop of the spread of AIDS. Wicker, like Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, as well as most medical officials, regarded education on preventing the disease as the best means of stopping its spread. The CDC's consensus was in opposition to mandatory testing for those seeking marriage licenses, and even the U.S. Public Health Service, the PHS, which proposed the original HIV exclusion rule for immigrants, held an official position against mandatory testing and in support of voluntary testing. And one way to explain the seeming contradiction of the PHS is that they opposed mandatory testing only for U.S. citizens. So talk now a little bit about common sense. In addition to sharing opinions with the most conservative members of the Reagan administration, Helms drew from broader common sense explanations being put forth by the PHS, which centered only on immigration and not on marriage licenses, and argued that given the existing list of excluded diseases, adding AIDS only makes sense. Helms, given that AIDS also includes concerns a medical and social issue, Helms also located his common sense approach in proximity to medical and scientific knowledge that affirmed his view. His rhetoric resonated with the PHS's justification of the original proposal in the supplementary information in the Federal Register, which stated, it is proposed that AIDS be added to the list of dangerous contagious diseases, since it would be anomalous to have diseases such as chancroid or lymphogranuloma venereum on such a list and not include AIDS. AIDS is added to the list because it is a recently defined sexually transmitted disease of significant public health importance. Now, by comparing AIDS with other diseases already in the exclusion list, this argument by analogy would seem only rational to many people due to existing fears about AIDS that people surely possessed in amounts far exceeding the ones they held for obscure diseases like chancroid. The PHS also sought to extend the reach of this proposed rule, adding further support to Helms' amendment. Now, before they made public the final review of public comments on its proposal to add AIDS to the dangerous contagious diseases list, in mid-May, national newspapers reported on the PHS's intent to modify that proposal in replacing AIDS with HIV infection. Originally announced in a memorandum by Robert E. Windom, Assistant Secretary for Health, whereas the proposal to add AIDS to the list would have only impacted those showing signs of AIDS, this rule would ensure that anyone seeking permanent residency would be tested. The timing of this announcement was uncanny. Applications for legalization through the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, usually remembered as the amnesty law because it provided a pathway to citizenship for certain undocumented immigrants living in the U.S. The applications for that began being processed on May 5th, 1987. An HHS spokesperson told the New York Times that he didn't know if this would impact those seeking legalization under IRCA. Well, as is clear in looking over the Senate debates over Helms' amendment, the amnesty program was definitely in the minds of some legislators, and those seeking to legalize through the IRCA program were impacted. Legal scholar Bettina Fernandez has suggested that while we'll never know why this original proposal came out of the PHS or in the form of the Helms Amendment, some facts are interesting to link together, which to her suggests that the HIV exclusion may have been proposed as a way to lessen the number of people who would naturalize. Now, whether such a claim has merit, putting these facts in its service easily draws from and contributes to another common sense logic, one mentioned above and with a long history in the United States, the rational fear of immigrants and their foreign diseases. So consider the following. The State Department, which also opposed the exclusion of HIV-infected immigrants due to the problems it would create for international relations and diplomacy, estimated that only 250 people annually would likely be excluded from immigrating to the U.S. under this rule. Now, the roughly 3 million people eligible for legalization under IRCA had to reside in the United States continually since January 1st, 1982, shortly after AIDS was discovered. The United States had the highest rate of AIDS in the entire world, and since people had to be continually present in the United States starting in 1982 in order to qualify for the amnesty, anyone seeking legalization almost undoubtedly contracted the disease in the United States. If it was likely that very few HIV-positive immigrants would seek entry to the United States, and also the case that undocumented people eligible for legalization contracted the disease in the United States, then the threat from outside would seem very minimal. This logic leads Fernandez to suggest that both Helms' amendment and the PHS proposal primarily targeted the undocumented people already in the United States who wanted to naturalize, regardless of their HIV status, because even people who had no fear of being HIV positive might have decided not to apply for legalization because of the possibility of taking an AIDS test with no guarantee of their privacy. Now, certainly such analysis and the motivations behind the PHS's and Helms' proposals can never be more than speculative, but it helps to provide a bigger frame of the context for these debates occurring amidst the confluence of fears about HIV/AIDS and fears about immigrants and who could belong to the nation. At a minimum, Helms capitalized on these existing discourses as well as the cultural moment surrounding immigration resulting from the passage and implementation of IRCA. Now, within the context of political rhetoric, as Robert Ivy puts it, arguments make common sense when there is no other possible sense that can be made of evidence. Helms worked hard to ensure that this would be the case. In his opening speech, Helms carefully maneuvered his common sense rhetoric by selectively using scientific evidence and also relying on guarded language so as not to make his common sense seem as if it was too aligned with particular moral or religious philosophies. For instance, he began this way. The purpose of this amendment is to protect the general population against the spread of AIDS. Now, his use of the word general signals that his focus was not on those currently suffering from AIDS, but rather on members of an imagined general population who are at some abstracted risk of contracting it. Yet, he kept his comments away from morally charged condemnations. In discussing the immigration amendment, he spoke only of the citizenry and the American people as a whole. Now, this move sheltered him from critics who might accuse him of turning AIDS into a moral concern. Despite his often virulent anti-gay rhetoric in this speech, he did not directly mention homosexuality at all, only speaking of the increased rate of contraction among heterosexuals in contrast to the, quote, established risk group, which he said everyone knew. Now, Helms introduced both parts of his amendment and then noted, there may be a great deal of argument about this amendment, but I cannot see why. Helms made a strong appeal to common sense, focusing initially on the marriage component. He said, mandatory premarital testing makes good sense as a preventative measure. Marriage licenses authorize couples to engage in sexual activities and to bring children into this world. Many states do not issue, because they weren't doing it before, many states do not issue marriage licenses to individuals infected with rubella or syphilis. Common sense dictates that states should not do so for individuals infected with AIDS. Drawing from a similar argument by analogy as used by the PHS in announcing their proposed ruling on immigration, Helms' claims of good and common sense can be seen as just that, but also in line with medical opinions. This point is affirmed as Helms moved on to cite statements and evidence from the PHS, the American Medical Association, and the CDC. Now, none of these entities offers support for Helms' proposition and what he cited from them, but Helms still carefully located his argument in relation to them to bolster his ethos. He then reminded the chamber that many states already have premarital testing again for a host of STDs, and further that the American public was on his side. And then he proceeded to cite several news polls about beliefs on mandatory testing, overwhelmingly on his side. Helms used the words simply, fair enough, and obvious to describe his immigration proposal. He further compared AIDS to other excluded conditions, proclaiming, I say again, what's the big deal? Why the opposition to adding AIDS to that already long list? Helms again drew on a limited scientific expert and scientific discourse to advocate his position, as he cited the number of cases reported in the United States and worldwide, as well as the number of infections predicted by Jonathan Mann, director of the World Health Organization's Special Program on AIDS. Helms followed the staggering statistics with a question. Is this something to debate about? He returned to the argument by analogy. We're excluding individuals with infectious syphilis. This is in the law, and that is being done. In all candor, does it make any sense that we should not exclude, or to put it more succinctly, forbid the entry of individuals infected with the AIDS virus as well? Ignoring the reality that most cases of HIV and AIDS existed in the United States, as well as the State Department predictions cited above about the small number of people who would be likely to be excluded, Helms cited a series of facts that asked listeners to deduce their own conclusions about the obviousness of a need for exclusion. The point is best illustrated in the following. It is only elementary that as the epidemic continues to spread abroad, Helms said, immigrants in greater numbers will be bringing the AIDS virus to the United States. So my amendment, I think, simply makes common sense. Now, Helms' deductive argument was technically valid, even if it ignored other important factors about the spread of HIV in the United States. And ignoring these other factors is precisely the point, as he clearly aimed for his claim to seem as if it was the only possible one that could be deduced. The heated debate Helms initiated was one of the first debates about AIDS, actually, that happened on the Senate floor. Interestingly, none of the senators involved in the debate came out directly in support of Helms' amendment. Several, including leading Republicans, stated their opposition to the amendment as proposed. Senators drew from a host of grounds for their arguments against the amendment, ranging from concerns over privacy, cost, and practical matters like the reliability and feasibility of mandatory testing, to concerns about the privileging of philosophy over science, discrimination, and driving at-risk people further underground. More often than not, they primarily opposed the premarital testing, sometimes stating clearly their support for the immigration provision, and other times just implying such support. Even for those who seemed most virulently opposed to this amendment, some important assumptions were still present. Those imagined as being entitled to the full benefits of legal U.S. citizenship were included in the construct of the American people, or the public, that senators deployed as in need of protection. Others, whether high-risk groups, prisoners, or immigrants, were not deemed part of the public that public health policies serve. Thus, even when opponents such as Becker insisted upon the problems with Helms' amendment on the basis of privileging science over philosophy, they shared certain parts of Helms' understanding of common sense, namely a vision of who belongs to the nation-state and who should be protected. So now I'm going to shift into the kind of national common sense part of the paper. Becker was the first senator to speak out against Helms' amendment during the May 21st debates. And though he applauded the senator from North Carolina for bringing the issue to the floor, on the surface, the only thing Becker shared with Helms was the following perspective. He said, certainly the threat of AIDS, the existence and the threat of AIDS, is the most severe crisis to be posed to this country in the lifetime of all of us, within and without this chamber. I might add that includes any armed conflict that occurred during that period of time. Now, locating the AIDS crisis within national borders and making the comparison between AIDS and armed conflict, a metaphor that was very common during this time period, Becker implicitly compared AIDS with a foreign enemy. Yet his approach to containing and defeating that threat seemingly excluded a philosophical premise, which is how he characterized the positions of Reagan and Helms. In fact, Becker repeatedly located himself on the side of science and placed Helms' common sense in the realm of philosophy and mere opinion. Becker indicted the approach of the Reagan administration as well as the amendment before the chamber when he stated, either we're going to go down the philosophical path or we're going to take the advice and the directions from the men and women of science and from the repositories of knowledge that are repositories of scientific knowledge. Whereas Helms emphasized the popular opinion polls that strengthened his position, Becker stressed the scientific organizations. But Becker clearly had no interest in completely separating the experts out from the rest of the nation, when he declared, everyone in this nation should take great pride in the rapidity of the discovery, isolating, and cloning of the AIDS virus. Never before in the history of man has any nation accomplished what was accomplished by our scientists and colleagues around the world. Now, though mentioning colleagues around the world, Becker clearly imagined the advances made on understanding the AIDS virus as U.S. American accomplishments, with the pride belonging to all U.S. Americans. Becker then justified the original emergency funds, putting this expenditure in a long line of other expenditures already approved, and crediting those monies with the fast response with prolonging and saving lives. He defended these responses as traditional, and then he proclaimed, we have never asked people in the past, and we should not now ask, how did you get your disease? We never pass judgment on lifestyle or any other matter. If there has been a threat, we have met it. We have always spoken loudly for life in this nation. We have never asked why. We have merely understood the threat, and we have gone to meet it. Now, this utopian depiction of the U.S. nation as both heroic and traditional partook in common sense logics about the value of the nation and the valor of its inhabitants. Weaker solidified a unified nation that responds to threats, no matter the content of those threats. Later in the speech, he extended the war metaphor, further locating AIDS as a foreign threat to the nation, explaining, "We face that threat," and he's talking about World War II, "as a nation, and we have to face this as a nation." Now, one could argue here that Weaker himself is the philosopher, as he clearly does not provide an empirical account of the United States. His unspoken deployment of a national common sense that unifies the people through the language of tradition and the invitation to the audience to imagine itself in the best light only served as a premise with which, though, to highlight how off-base and philosophical Helms and members of the Reagan administration really were. Weaker supported this through a return to science, insisting, "I do not rise to oppose the amendment of the distinguished senator from North Carolina on the basis that I am a liberal and he is a conservative." Can you imagine a Republican now saying, "because I am a liberal"? It's unreal, it's 20 years. But he said, "because I'm a liberal and he is a conservative." That has absolutely no part in this debate. What has part in this debate is that every single credible scientific source opposes what the senator from North Carolina is asking for. Now, Weaker's blending of a supposedly unified set of national values that engender the United States' traditional approach to threats with scientific discourse allows him some important maneuverability. He could, on the one hand, utilize similar sources of invention as Helms and thereby connect with the general U.S. American audience. On the other hand, he was still able to claim his primary grounding in science. The rhetorical maneuvering back and forth between these two lines of argument allowed an articulation with a version of common sense, at the same time that Weaker disarticulated with a mere opinion and philosophy that he claimed informed Helms' amendment. Weaker's appeals to this national common sense also manifested in the ways he discussed the two specific components of Helms' amendment. In Weaker's discussion of the marriage license provision, he noted that one of the key concerns was that the tests available were not entirely accurate, which, if you know anything about this time, they really weren't accurate at all. This meant not only that some people would be given false positives, but some would be given false negatives, which would give them a false sense of security. Weaker stated emphatically that no scientific or medical evidence existed to support mandatory testing for those seeking a marriage license. In a back and forth with Senator John Danforth, the Republican of Missouri, who was primarily concerned with cost and seemed to disbelieve or be unpersuaded by scientific opinion about the accuracy of tests, at first, Weaker stood firmly to his position on the side of science. When he came to the question of immigration, he found himself unclear with how to reconcile the contradiction between the PHS's position and that of other scientific bodies. Because Helms aligned his common sense argument with the PHS, this particular point made it hard for Weaker to stand firm in the science as the PHS, a scientific entity, contradicted the position he took, even if others like the Surgeon General did not. Now, Danforth switched gears, turning his attention to the exorbitant cost of the $30 million emergency fund and wondering about the payoff. He enacted a slippery slope argument asking the Senate to imagine future costs that the government would be expected to incur once they make a commitment such as the one before them. Danforth's insistent focus on costs and his continual statement of inflated numbers of infected people in order to lend credence to his claims provoked Weaker to an impassioned discourse about the value of life and the problems with placing it in monetary terms. Here again, Weaker deployed a war metaphor, imploring his colleagues, "Yes, the business of life is expensive, not as expensive as the business of death. There are not many questions posed around here on that multi-million-dollar budget." Now, several times throughout this intense exchange, Weaker juxtaposed spending and debate over spending on AIDS with excessive spending on the military, naming it only as the business of death. In building on his earlier claims about the United States' quote, traditional way of affirming life, Weaker again drew on an unstated argument that articulated with a kind of national common sense. In this edition, spending on life should be more traditional than spending on death, particularly when the lives being debated were those that were imagined as part of the U.S. American citizenry. After numerous senators stated their opposition to Helms' amendment due to various concerns as mentioned above, Danforth issued a point of order. he suggested that the original amendment to appropriate emergency funds for those who were on the clinical trial was legislation on an appropriations bill and therefore inappropriate. The presiding officer at the time said that that point would lie. So the effect of this would be that the point of order would also carry Helms' amendment, and as was revealed in debate, the original amendment would not be able to be reintroduced without a substantial change. Killing both parts of the amendment together was clearly a strategy on Danforth's part, who was throughout the debate skeptical about whether the original funds should be allocated. Now, Weaker challenged the point of order, asking for an appeal for the opposite reason, suggesting that the two parts needed to be able to be treated separately. Others offered different suggestions for how to rectify the situation. Helms indicated that he may very well be willing to change his original amendment. And then he also reminded the chamber of the simplicity of his amendment and reiterated the strong support of the American people. He entered several pieces of popular opinion poll data into the congressional record, and again, relevant quotations from doctors and experts. A continual strategy of Helms during this time. When Weaker offered his closing statement in the May 21st debates, he repeatedly expressed his agreement with Helms for his work to get a vote on the amendment. Now, this repeated agreement might seem like mere artifice, but it foreshadowed the eventual agreement the two would share on issues much bigger than whether a certain vote should take place or the importance of not tiptoeing away from the problem. Senator Don Nichols, the Republican from Oklahoma, intervened in Weaker's speech, asking him if he would agree to mandatory testing for high-risk groups. And then Weaker responded, "Indeed, I have already conceded that part of the senator's amendment is not that bad. The Public Health Service itself feels that certain immigrants, the 530,000 that are asking for permanent residence, should be tested. That recommendation is before Secretary Bowen and others." Weaker followed his now conditional acceptance of the immigration exclusion with a weaker procedural argument stating, "But what we should not be doing when all of this is in the works right now is taking this amendment on the whole, if you will, and sticking it on the supplemental." This statement is a far cry from his earlier decrying of privileging philosophy over science. After conceding on the point about immigration, Weaker concluded his speech with an impassioned plea to vote for the $30 million in emergency funds for those in the nation. Weaker revealed his ultimate concern, one that he shared with Helms and others. What makes sense is protecting the nation's borders and protecting the nation's citizenry. The entire debate on the amendment concluded with an agreement to put aside the point of order and appeal in order to wait for the completion of a private meeting between interested parties to see if an agreement could be reached, and then returning to the Senate floor. But, of course, the agreement had already more or less been reached. Helms had indicated he was willing to change his original amendment. Weaker had essentially conceded on the immigration exclusion, and nearly everyone else in the chamber had expressed primary opposition to the marriage amendment, with tacit or even overt support for the immigration piece. One way to make sense of this tentative agreement would be to suggest that this is an example of how deliberative processes work and compromise is achieved. Further, one could easily argue that the job of the U.S. Congress is to protect the nation's borders and its citizenry. Isn't that common sense? What good does it do to read these debates as evidence that a coalition based on a national common sense has emerged? Well, after the closed-door meetings among interested parties, on May 29, 1987, Helms proposed a new amendment, number 248, which removed the references to marriage licenses altogether. This new amendment read, "To provide that none of the funds provided by the Act for the emergency provision of drugs determined to prolong the lives of individuals with AIDS shall be obligated or expended after June 30th, 1987, if on that date the President has not added human immunodeficiency virus infection to the list of dangerous contagious diseases contained in Title 42. The Senator later changed the date to August 30th and then finally to August 31st. Now, just 2 days after Helms proposed this revised amendment, President Reagan delivered his first public address on the administration's policy on AIDS at a dinner in honor of the American Foundation for AIDS Research on May 31st. Reagan's speech paralleled the arguments made in the May 21st Senate debate, including support for adding AIDS to the list of dangerous contagious diseases. Given that Helms had already provided his revised amendment that left off the marriage piece, a coalition was set in place to produce a unified position. The factors that led Weaker to build this coalition with Helms will never be clearly known. Once the proper citizens represented and those who sought to marry were no longer targets, the nation and its values could be more or less protected. Weaker had little ground upon which to defend against the immigrant exclusion, since his ultimate priority was the original $30 million in emergency funds to help U.S. citizens afford life-prolonging drugs. And immigrant exclusion may very well have led to those funds not being approved. His ground was further weakened since the science he trusted was conflicted on the point of immigrant exclusion. In the end, because Weaker premised so much of his argument on a rhetoric of national common sense that he shared with conservatives like Reagan and Helms, even if he had hoped to protect immigrant rights, it is clear that protecting immigrant rights could not remain his concern. Immigrants are the ultimate other to the nation. Now, debate resumed in the Senate on June 2nd, as senators were now left to consider only the fate of immigrants seeking to enter the United States and those who could pursue legalization through IRCA. Helms reintroduced his amendment, again noting its straightforwardness, and detailed how it was congruent with what the president had outlined on May 31st. He also described it as, quote, an incentive to help ensure that the PHS's proposed rule adding HIV infection to the list of dangerous contagious diseases will be added to the list and will be added promptly. He reminded the chamber, again, that the federal government has the obligation to protect its citizenry from foreigners immigrating to this country who carry deadly diseases which threaten the health and safety of U.S. citizens. Weaker began his response expressing frustration with the $30 million that was still attached to whether the administration adds AIDS to the list of dangerous diseases. But Helms quickly interrupted him, agreeing to detach the amendment from the emergency appropriations of $30 million to support those who had participated in the clinical trials. So Weaker, in turn, decided not to call a point of order against Helms' amendment for legislating on an appropriations bill, and thus Helms' new amendment read as follows. This is the final one that was approved. On or before August 31st, 1987, the President, pursuant to his existing power under Section 212A6 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, shall add human immunodeficiency virus infection to the list of dangerous contagious diseases contained in Title 42. Despite no connection to appropriations whatsoever, Danforth and others reluctantly agreed to allow the legislation on the appropriations bill, even as some worried about the implications of doing so. Despite his impassioned opposition just over a week earlier, with the marriage license provisions and the appropriations contingency removed, Senator Weaker had little other than praise for Helms' leadership. In his speech, which concluded with his statement of support for Helms' amendment, though Weaker returned to, his speech concluded with that, though he returned to his original position about the importance of privileging science over philosophy, while simultaneously, of course, engaging in a philosophical lament about the un-Americanness of assessing blame. This familiar double move on the part of Weaker reiterated his own commitment to national common sense, as he again called on the nation to imagine itself as the best it could, because that was the ultimate weapon in the battle against AIDS. Although he praised Helms' leadership in discussing the president's speech, he reiterated that the position of Helms and Reagan was purely philosophical, as it issued a moral judgment on that which should be considered only a health or scientific concern. For Weaker, those judgments were not only cruel, but they were antithetical to the logic of this country. In issuing an indictment that attempted to locate him on the side of reason, science, and the nation, Weaker momentarily recognized the ways in which immigrants, the other to the nation, became the scapegoat that enabled him to ultimately coalesce with Helms and Reagan despite his rhetoric against them. Turning completely away from the global significance of AIDS, the nation became the only unit worthy of protection, and the protection Weaker envisioned was the ultimate one, protection from certain death for which everyone held some responsibility. Weaker insisted, whether it is a sacrifice of our sensibilities or a sacrifice of our money, this is really what it comes down to, and this body will be called upon time and again to supply the wherewithal to accomplish both of these things. Perhaps noting his own sensibilities, which had been sacrificed, Weaker issued his final rationale. I will vote for the amendment of the distinguished senator from North Carolina, not because it is the amendment of the distinguished senator from North Carolina, but because it is the recommendation of the Public Health Service, and that is the last point I want to leave with my colleagues. In attempting to return to the values of the American people and the importance of letting the scientific voice reign, Weaker presumably imagined, at least in part, that he had been able to keep consistent with his original positions, seeming as if he had compromised rather than been compromised. Senator Bob Dole, Republican of Kansas, offered one of the few challenges to the new amendment on grounds of privacy and administrative bureaucracy, but this point was left to hang in the room as in the end, a completely unified coalition of conservative and liberal senators in the Senate approved the appropriations bill in a 96-0 vote, including Section 518, which added AIDS to the list of dangerous contagious diseases in immigration law. A national common sense that unified Weaker and Helms in coalition succeeded. This success protects those already included in the bounds of citizenship and leaves those typically outside. As Antonio Gramsci has noted, common sense refers to the incoherent folklore and beliefs that characterize the conformity of a given people to the interest of the ruling class. This understanding of common sense is useful because it locates it as a tool of hegemony and also recognizes its collective and contradictory dimensions. As deployed by Weaker and affirmed by the Senate, national common sense that sets the bounds for who can belong and insists on protection of those who do belong is a classic example of Gramscian understanding of common sense. No matter the international implications, the ethical considerations for non-citizens inside and outside the country, national common sense evades such considerations. In my work, I've argued passionately in favor of coalition as an alternative to other kinds of limiting politics, including liberal politics of inclusion and utopian politics of some queer theorists. Coalition, like agency and other terms key to political and social theory, cannot only be rendered in progressive or radical terms, even though such potential certainly exists. Instead, this paper has shown how a national common sense formed the foundation for an unlikely political coalition in a deliberative, not activist context. This coalition had the ends of rendering impenetrable boundaries between those imagined and protected as U.S. citizens and those not. As an agreeable side of coalition, national common sense is a pragmatic value that can render seemingly incommensurable positions commensurate in the name of the national interest. The coalition resulted in a compromise or agreement, but viewing agreement as a product of coalition helps to uncover the strategy involved and the temporary/temporal nature of the conditions that led to the agreement. The language of coalition offers a useful framework here because coalition is by definition a fraught condition and process, as are the relationships and alliances forged in both activist and deliberative context, which is a point I want to elaborate on much further in the chapter. This study is important not just because it reveals how a deliberative coalition emerges from familiar scapegoating of immigrant communities, but because it also shows the deep logics of a national common sense that led to such scapegoating and exclusion. This study implores us to discover a richer understanding of common sense, to confront it in its multiple and subtle manifestations. Undoubtedly, the logics that rationalize the exclusion of one non-citizen group were already being simultaneously deployed to exclude and punish those that should have been protected as citizens. While senators like Weaker were less willing to sacrifice those people, he had relied on logics that would also be used to exclude them, revealing the importance of understanding the implications of our coalitions, and in this instance, the risks of national common sense. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions, if anybody has them. Okay.
Thank you for that really wonderful talk. I really love this concept of national common sense, and I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts. I don't even know, I'm thinking this through still, but are there any national common sense conditions that made possible the lifting of the ban in 2010? Or does that sort of conceptual framework not really sort of get us towards, or are there other conditions that are circulating at the time of a more 2010 context?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think it also points to the kind of oscillation between coalition as a productive force and coalition as maybe a regressive or progressive and regressive force. I mean, it's interesting. I think in part what happened with 2010 was somewhat similar, capitalizing on the moment, because really what happened from about 93 to 2006, there wasn't a lot of work on overturning the immigration ban because it was just kind of like there's so much else going on. Some people were working on it a little bit, but in 2006, people like Nancy Ordover decided, okay, now there's all these immigration marches, we should capitalize on this. And so I think that it was in part capitalizing on that moment, but I also think it was that Obama was pretty open to that, and it happened rather quietly through administrative procedures, and so it was less. But maybe, I don't know, I need to think about that. It's a really good question, because I think I'm interested in mapping how this kind of, whether it's national common sense or something else, how this kind of maps out in these different ways, particularly around the issue of immigration, because I do think that ends up playing out in these various ways. But I haven't thought about it enough in that context, but I will, or maybe we can think about it together. Thanks for that.
So you touched on this briefly earlier in your talk, but I still found it interesting that in his common sense appeal, Helms excluded or didn't really touch on, I guess, moralistic themes when formulating his argument. Like, most of his arguments had to do with the simplicity of adding HIV and AIDS to the list, as opposed to, more religious-based argument or more moralistic argument. And given that a lot of the angst or national hysteria surrounding the disease in the 80s was because of religious, or the fact that it was is perceived as a sexual disease, do you think adding those themes to his argument, or kind of changing it in that way, would have had different implications, or kind of disallowed the possibility of that coalition?
I think that's a great question. I think this moment is fascinating, because if you read, and actually just 1 week later, so Helms is in the Senate introducing for the first time his AIDS Control Act, which he introduced several times, which was just like this hugely draconian piece of legislation that advocated the immigration piece was in this, and the marriage amendment. All these were in that piece of legislation, and he was much more overtly moral in his speech there, as he normally was. So I do think this is an interesting moment for him where he didn't do that, and I think we'll never know what goes on behind closed doors. Part of me thinks, and I'm going to see if I can find anything to prove this, that he actually never really cared about the marriage amendment, but that was where he was doing some political theater. But perhaps he and Weaker had talked ahead of time, or his staffers had talked to Weaker's staffers, and he knew that this would be this would get the people that were supporting him in North Carolina. They would be like, oh yeah, he's still doing what we want him to do. But then this compromise could happen over something that they would agree with too, but that also you could get more liberals too. So I absolutely do think it has something to do with it, but I haven't figured out the sort of details of it yet. But it's a great question.
Okay, so we have about a little over 5 minutes left, and so we're just going to take one more question. Oh, 4:15. Oh, sorry. We have 20 minutes left, so we're going to take many more questions.
I was like, wow, I talked a long time.
I have one sort of like a very short kind of utilitarian factual question, and then a sort of broader question about Weiker's argument. So the first question is just, in the context of the controversy, was there a sense when this debate started that the bill was going to pass in some form, or was there a very vibrant controversy about whether we'd get anything at all? And that's just sort of like, I'm interested in what the expectations kind of were from the institutional standpoint. And then the second question about Weiker's appeal is, I was very fascinated by the fact that he invoked philosophy so often. And I wonder if maybe that doesn't speak to a little bit of what Trevor said in terms of there might have been no need to make the moral argument once somebody at the sort of height of the power of the moral majority was basically calling a religious faction that was there and implied philosophers, which would sort of touch on a probably very dangerous kind of trend in secularism to some, and so I wonder if you might maybe comment upon that absence or that presence in the debate as well.
Yeah, I think that, and I need to do more sort of broader looking during this time period about that kind of language, the kind of philosophy versus science language, because I do think that I think that's an interesting way that he definitely took up that appeal. And I don't know that I have much more to say about it at this point other than what I've said, because I've just not been into the materials as much as I need to be. Speaking to your first point, my sense is that there was anticipation that this would pass eventually, or at least that the immigration piece would pass eventually. And so the debate, and again, this is on an appropriations bill, which these are always fascinating when you're supposed to be talking about other things, but people bring on stuff that has nothing to do with it. Most people were really worried that they were rushing through this because, like I said, this was really one of the first times AIDS was actually debated on the Senate floor, and nobody knew what the hell they were talking about. Like, people were putting articles from the Reader's Digest in the Congressional Record as like expert material on AIDS. That's where we were at this time. And so that was I think everyone sort of was like, yeah, we need to do something about this eventually, but we don't know enough right now. But what's funny is they didn't want to put that much time and energy into it. So like several people proposed, well, why don't we just get a small panel, maybe 2 experts who can come in here for 2 or 3 hours and explain to us, all the details that we need to know, and then we can make our decision. So like even then they weren't interested in doing anything elaborate. But I do think there was an expectation it would pass eventually. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer to your second question.
I've been HIV positive for 20 years, so I spent a lot of time thinking about these things, and I've been active in the issue for longer than that. One of the things that I think that plays into the common sense issue is that in the 1980s, we didn't really know whether a heterosexual epidemic would occur in the United States or in the Western world. That actually never happened. I mean, I'm not saying that people didn't get HIV that were heterosexual. They certainly did. But it never occurred in the numbers that I think the panic that was occurring in the 1980s and to a certain extent through the 1990s. So consequently, our arguments as HIV activists that this could spread into the larger community may have played heavily into the sort of hysteria that Helms was trying to foment. So that's one thing that, and then you get into the Obama administration and the ban disappears. It's basically because I think at least subconsciously, even though, we're telling all the heterosexual students at the University of Iowa they need to get tested for HIV, it became fairly clear that that wasn't happening. So this may explain some of the things that, or some of the reasons why we're not suffering under this ban right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's both of those are great points. And I think, Helms was never afraid of being promiscuous in his sources of invention. He whatever would help to serve the kinds of arguments he was making. So I think that probably the sort of discourse that HIV/AIDS activists were engaging in at the time, he probably absolutely used that to his benefit in a certain way.
I mean, we all benefited by the fact that we didn't know.
Yep.
And I think that there's some people in the HIV/AIDS community that don't really want us to realize that this epidemic or the epidemic is actually confined to small communities. I'm kind of hesitant to even admit that because I've certainly been the beneficiary of maybe some of the research that came about because of that. But we really didn't know, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, then that characterizes all the discourse of the time. Absolutely. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful talk. I actually have 2 questions for you. One is I'm wondering if there was a similar kind of coalition of activist response, coalition in the sense of like queer and AIDS activists and immigration activists to this legislation. And then my other question is sort of a more conceptual question about the way you're thinking about coalitions. I really like that you're making this almost kind of counterintuitive move to think about a coalition that is not a progressive one. And I just wonder, in the way that you're thinking about coalition building, if there's something different about that process when the coalition is one that's working for progressive social change as opposed to one that is more conservative in the sense of kind of upholding hegemonic norms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, those are both great questions. Toward the first one, I mean, keep in mind, so spring of 1987, this is when ACT UP is organizing too. And so this is an immensely dense time in terms of all that's going on. And it was really like about in 1989, at least from the materials that I have so far, that folks really started to organize seriously around this issue. AIDS activists who are maybe more queer identified, as well as immigration activists. There's some materials that I've been able to find. People are kind of talking about this specifically because it's impacting people through the 1986 amnesty. Earlier than that, so you'll see a mention here and there, like we need to figure out what to do about this, and people were unclear about what to do. And then in 1989, people really start pushing to try and get the exclusion removed in the 1990 Immigration Act. And then again in the early 90s, surrounding the international AIDS conferences, this is when this issue really gets a lot of attention, because the international AIDS conferences, one was held in San Francisco, but of course people who were HIV positive couldn't come to the US to attend the conference. And so then, you know, there was this, the government tried to basically pit travelers against immigrants, say, oh, well, we'll let, temporary travelers come, no problem, but not immigrants. And some people took that bait, some didn't. And then there was actually a boycott of the one that was supposed to be held in Boston 2 years later, ended up getting moved to Europe. And, there's this famous activist named Tomás Fabregas, and he staged this huge kind of one-man protest. Went to the AIDS conference, and I think it was in Amsterdam, and he comes back and he sort of says, I defy, George W. Bush, please put me in a detention center. And he's standing with Liz Taylor on this stage. And he was an ACT UP activist, but he was also involved in the California Coalition for Immigrant Rights. So there was a lot of that going on a little bit later that was definitely a response to this. The second thing about coalition, I mean, I'm really in my early thinking on this. So part of this is to try and challenge my own work on coalition, but I'm not sure yet what the differences are, in part because I'm dealing with two planes. So on the one hand, it's that I'm saying this is sort of a regressive or maybe a conservative coalition, but I'm also looking at it within the deliberative as opposed to the activist context. And so there's these two separate parts of this that I'm trying to, tease out a little bit to see what I think those different dimensions are. So I don't yet have a satisfactory answer, but it's definitely part of what I'm trying to think through. So thanks for that.
Carmel, I wonder if you can address the thing about the research process and what kind of documents you have access to, because I'm not well versed in what the kinds of documents they're required to keep for what the aides are working on, or if you have records of meetings that you suggested there might have been meetings between the aides of the two senators and so on. So what you've presented here, just what was said on the floor, the actual proposed legislation, but what else do you have access to?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for that. So yeah, like you said, this is primarily drawn from congressional record, the different debates, and then of course the pieces of legislation. Becker has a good bit of his materials online. Actually, his archive is a lot of it is documented online. I haven't dug yet into any of Helm's materials, but it's something that I eventually probably will do. I can only imagine the gold mines that are in there if anyone kept them in there. So some of those kinds of archives are in part what I'm looking at. There's a bunch of hearings, and the next piece of this moves into kind of how so this is the first debate, and then I'm moving into how the kind of key moments between 87 and 93, that's going to be the next part of this. And so there were several hearings that were had, and things like that I'm looking at. And then the other piece of this is looking at ACT UP archives and other HIV/AIDS activist archives at the New York Public Library, the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco. So, and in there they have a lot of different exchange that they had with different senators and representatives. And so, as with all archival stuff, it's a bit of a hodgepodge of things, but it's a lot of documents. I don't know if that fully answers, but.
Hi, Karma. Thanks. Great talk. I had a couple of questions. I'm just wondering about two perhaps contextual issues since this was passed in August in 1987. And I'm wondering, first of all, the extent to which somebody like Jesse Helms maybe fell back on the trope of common sense quite a bit. It strikes me as a really conservative term when you talk about something like taxes or something like that. You know, often the household metaphor becomes one in which you can appeal to common sense. You know, regular people just wouldn't do this. And the other one I was wondering about, if this is fall 87, for example, moving into fall 87, we know that the caucuses start early in 88. And I'm wondering the extent to which maybe some people were really eager to not have this be a narrative that inserted itself into the presidential elections early.
Yeah, that's a great point. The second one, I can only imagine. I mean, there was so much pressure on Reagan's administration at this time. So, I mean, C. Everett Koop put out his Surgeon General's report in 1986, which was supposed to be sent to every household in the U.S. And you know, the Reagan administration was hugely divided on this issue because Koop was very much invested in prevention and education, and Bauer and Bennett and Reagan were very much invested in this sort of testing, maybe quarantining, just like get it off the radar. And so I do think that there was a lot of pressure for the Reagan administration to unify something and also to actually do something. I mean, you know, famously, it wasn't until April, right, of 1987 that the first public speech where Reagan actually mentions it, and then the first speech fully on AIDS is, you know, at this exact time. So that probably was part of it. I definitely need to, you know, look through into that more, especially the fall stuff, because these debates continue on into the fall. And the second point is common sense. Absolutely. I mean, I think the literature in our field that talks about common sense totally connects it to this certain kind of conservative logic. And I think that's what I'm trying to also push back on a little bit with this, what if I end up calling it national common sense, whatever it is, because you have someone who's a self-avowed liberal who ends up relying on these same kinds of logics in a certain way, but they're subtler. I mean, they're almost enthymematic. And so I'm kind of wanting to challenge how we've put common sense on the side of conservatism only and saying actually it functions in this much broader way. So great point. Thanks.
Hi, Karma. Great talk. And this may be a very unfair question from someone who doesn't know the theory in this area at all. But I'm sort of reflecting on the work I was doing in Santa Barbara and hope to continue here on undocumented immigrants and identity struggles, and as part of that, LGBTQ undocumented immigrants and their sort of intersecting struggles. And it got me thinking that you're talking about individuals at the intersection of three underprivileged identities: illness, immigration, immigrants, and LGBT sort of status. So the general thought is, how is voice given to individuals at three such intersections? And how does the idea of national common sense then play when such individuals are at so many layers the bottom of the power rung in that notion of nationality? Yeah. So I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud about these issues, but I don't know if you have, if you can speak to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a really great question. I think it's, I will actually probably answer it more through some of my more contemporary focused research, because I think we've seen this a lot post 2006 again with like the undocumented youth movement in the U.S. And so, which I've written a bit about, you have these folks who, some also at the intersection of illness, many, poor kids, kids of color who are queer and who are undocumented, and who have actually tried to adopt their own kind of version of this national common sense. And so you have a guy like Jose Antonio Vargas, who is the journalist. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He came out as undocumented in 2011 because all these kids who are younger than him were doing it. He was like, oh my God, they're, these kids who have nothing, and I'm this famous journalist, so I should do it too. So he comes out, and now, he calls himself an undocumented American. right? And so, and he's very privileged in a certain way, but taking up that kind of voice, becoming a role model, a kind of leader for others. But there's always risk in that, and I think there was risk at this time too. So the guy I mentioned before, like Tomás Fabregas, like he too had a lot of class privilege. He was a European immigrant, and so there were these issues that made it very hard for these spokespeople. And I think generally that's the concern about like this question of giving voice and this question of how can you use these strategies like common sense, because inevitably, I mean, like with the undocumented youth movement now, what about their parents, right? And this is a point that keeps coming up over and over. And so I think it's in some ways at the heart of questions I'm always trying to wrestle with in my work. And I think it's a really great question to ask.
Okay, we have time for one more. For real this time.
Hey. I am interested in this shift from fieldwork and activists in enclavic spaces being coalitions to referring to senators on the floor of the Senate as coalitions. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more, because I feel like part of your earlier critique in mobilizing coalitions and why we would use that term instead of seriality, which Bennett has used or other people have used to talk about conservative coming together of different political positions and subjectivities, is that it enables us to make a critique of individual liberal autonomous subjectivity.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, is it in the archival work that maybe you're continuing on in other parts that you will undo the individuals, or is there a point to pushing back on the earlier claim and saying maybe that was less of what was at stake in the earlier argument?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I don't have a fully developed answer to it yet. I mean, in part, I'm just kind of playing with this to what happens if we bring this kind of critique to coalition. And so in some ways, it's an intellectual exercise for me at this point to see if I'm gonna be persuaded that this is worth pushing back on. And I'm not quite sure yet. I mean, there's another way to sort of just say, as I mentioned at one point in the paper, it's like, well, this is also just deliberation. So what's the upshot for thinking of this as coalition? And I'm not sure. It's kind of a rabbit hole I'm trying to zero down right now to see if I do think there's something there. But I do think that it will be interesting for exactly the reasons why I was drawn to coalition in the first place, which you've articulated. If I do end up deciding I think this is an appropriate use of how a kind of regressive form of coalition can develop, then what does that tell us about subjectivity, even among elites and the most powerful? And it may be nothing at all, but it's definitely part of the kind of theoretical track I'm trying to figure out. So it's a great question.
Okay, thank you very much.